November 19, 1944. The dusk settled over Iwo Jima like a silent breath held between thunderclaps. A gray sea stretched to the horizon, the sky bruised and heavy with impending danger. Somewhere aboard a battered transport ship anchored offshore, salt-stung men gathered gear, helmets, rifles, spare tracks, their faces lit by lanterns and haunted by the knowledge that soon they would fight on an island like no other. Far below, the volcanic ash and basalt of Iwo Jima lay dormant, waiting. The air felt thick with smoke, salt, and dread. As a historian narrator, I walk you through that night not as a detached observer, but as one who can almost smell the powder, feel the tremor of engines, hear the whisper of secrecy. In the gloom, a handful of Japanese tanks sat hidden, their flat forms unassuming under tarps. To any Allied pilots scanning the seas or even approaching the beaches, they were invisible. But these machines, odd, out of place, perhaps even weird by the standards of the great armored guns of Europe, would soon become ghosts in the volcanic rock. Weapons that would surprise American Marines, not by booming assaults across open ground, but by emerging silent, unexpected from Earth itself. It was months before the landings that this strange armored force had even reached Iwo Jima. The unit was the 26th Tank Regiment. Under the command of Takeichi Nishi, an unlikely tank commander, once an Olympic-class equestrian, now burdened with the island's fate. 28 tanks had originally sailed with Nishi's men from Busan, Korea in mid-1944 aboard the transport Nisshu Maru, but on July 18th, that convoy came under attack, torpedoed by a submarine of the United States Navy, and all those tanks vanished under the sea, sinking with the vessel. Only 2 of Nishi's men perished. What replaced them? Months later, seems almost improvised. A trio of line companies, cobbled together with whatever tanks could be spared. A mixture of older light tanks and medium tanks. In total, roughly 35 tanks eventually landed on Iwo. A mixture of Type 95 Hogo light tanks and Type Joshitsu Shinhōtō Chi-Ha medium tanks, the Shinhōtō representing a later variant with upgraded turret and gun. Yet, and this is where the mystery begins, these were not tanks destined for sweeping charges or open-field maneuvers. Iwo's terrain, jagged ridges, volcanic ash, caves, crevices, simply would not allow for it. Instead, under Nishi's orders and by necessity, these steel beasts were transformed, buried up to their turrets, stripped of mobility, repurposed as dread pillboxes. Their tracks rusted beneath the dirt, their engines silent. I remember the moment I realized what this meant. The weird Japanese tank isn't weird because it's amphibious or futuristic, but because it embodies wartime desperation and camouflage, because it's not meant to move, but to wait. The tank becomes a stone-like sentinel, a ghost hiding in rock and ash, ready to surprise. And surprise they did. Because come February 19, 1945, D-Day, when U.S. Marines stormed the beaches and flooded inland, expecting the familiar horrors of machine gun nests, mortar, caves, and pillboxes, they also got something else. At certain hills, ridges, and airfield approaches from Hill 382 to the defiles around airstrips, the recoil of a 47mm tank, gun flowering from what looked like a rocky outcrop, or a turret poking from volcanic ash, sudden, deadly, and uncanny to the men charging across ash plains or trudging up ridges. At first, the island seemed like another fortified beach. Then the first shots rang out, not from dug-in bunkers, but from tanks. But these tanks moved not. They waited. They offered no thunderous advance. Instead, they gave flinching Marines the creeping sensation. They had walked into a trap built from bone-hard rock that more than anything makes these Japanese tanks on Iwo Jima weird. Not weird in the sense of strange technology, Weird because their role defied expectation. They were not cavalry. They were not fast. They were silent demons, buried in those early hours after landing. As dawn's gray light smeared the volcanic soil with pallid blue, I can almost see through a Marine's eyes. First, the gray-brown ash, then a shape half buried. Turret glinting faintly, something awake. The sea breeze carrying sulfur. The smell of burnt cordite as the 47mm shells tore through sandbags. Earth, perhaps flesh. For the defenders, the Japanese tank crews cramped behind the gun. It must have felt like the rock itself had eyes, had teeth. They held their fire until close range. Their guns, thin armored by any measure, were no match for the thick armor of an M for Sherman. The 47mm gun could, at best, punch through 67 to 75mm of vertical armor at 500 yards, enough to threaten flanks. Rears, maybe lighter tanks. But hopeless against frontal armor. And yet, it was enough. Because it wasn't high-speed, long-range tank combat. It was ambush, surprise, fear in the first days of the invasion. American commanders had assumed that Japanese armor on Iwo would either be minimal or rendered useless by terrain, with roughly a 4-to-1 superiority. In armor, the Americans fielding more than twice the number of tanks and amphibious armored vehicles compared to the Japanese 60-odd or so. They believed the Japanese tanks would be quickly neutralized. They were wrong. The understrength 26th Tank Regiment may have numbered only 35 tanks, but they had the advantage of secrecy. As per the defense plan, Nishi had distributed the 3 companies. First company deployed south near one sector. Second company to the west and north of Key Hills. Third company in the east. Their headquarters rested near Motoyama, behind the expected front lines. When the Americans began their advance, many of these tanks refused to budge, not for lack of will, but because the terrain forbade mobility. As reports and after-action studies confirm, these Japanese medium and light tanks were employed not as maneuver armor, but as fixed defensive weapons, anti-tank guns in tank hulls. Some apparently even had their turrets removed, with the guns emplaced in fortified positions. Others were dug in hull down, with only the turret exposed above ash and rock, effectively converted into improvised pillboxes. One of the most dramatic instances came at Hill 382, a rocky rise northeast of Motoyama's airstrip. There, a Shinhōtō Chi-Ha turret with 47mm gun lay in wait. The Marines, advancing under the weight of expectations and confidence in their multi-battalion armor superiority, were suddenly confronted with a tank gun that seemed to grow from stone. The discharge was quick. The shell cut through sandbag revetments, tore into tracks, or punched weak points in light armor. Panic, confusion, then a hasty retreat. In the smoky seconds that followed, bulldozer teams and flamethrower tanks surged forward. But not before the Japanese gun crew had vanished into caves. Tunnels, the volcanic guts of Iwo, for the Americans. The psychological effect was immediate. The island wasn't just defended by bunkers. It was defended by phantom tanks, sleeping steel beasts that could strike from the earth itself. Why did the Japanese choose this strange, static use of armor? Because for all their determination, they lacked the means for classical tank warfare here. The tanks available Hago light tanks and Chi-Ha. Mediums were thinly armored, armor rarely exceeding 25mm. Their firepower, while adequate against infantry or soft-skinned vehicles, was no match for the 75mm armed Shermans. With their thick frontal plates, more importantly, Iwo Jima's terrain, volcanic ash, uneven ridges, caves, narrow gullies simply did not allow maneuver. Tanks rolling across a beach or open plain. Impossible. The island offered no plains. Instead, it was a tortured landscape of rock and shadow. The defenders adapted accordingly. Armored vehicles became static guns. Tank crews became stationary sentries in that sense. The Japanese commanders solved two interconnected problems. First, they denied the island to the Americans by making every ridge, every hill, every rock a potential firing position. Second, they compensated for their quantitative inferiority in armor by playing a psychological and tactical game, hidden ambush. Surprise? Fear. Technically speaking, the choice of the Type Joshuti Shinhōtō Chi-Ha was significant. While the earlier Type 97 had a low-velocity 57mm gun, more suited for infantry support, the Shinhōtō variant carried the much more potent Type 147mm high-velocity gun. This weapon, though lightweight compared to Allied tank guns, fired armor-piercing high-explosive (PHE) rounds capable of penetrating 67 to 75mm of vertical armor at 500 yards, enough to threaten Shermans from the sides or rear. The tank carried up to 104 rounds of 47mm ammunition, typically 66 AF and 38 He stored in the turret bustle, hull racks, and sponson bins. Secondary armament included two 7.7mm machine guns, one bow-mounted on the hull, one on the turret roof. Interestingly, there was no coaxial machine gun next to the main gun, a design deficiency in many new Japanese tanks. But the firepower wasn't the real strength. The secret lay in camouflage and concealment. Many of these tanks were discreetly integrated into defensive networks revetted with sandbags, concealed behind ash and volcanic rock, positioned in gullies and near caves, often using the ash itself to form revetments. Some were even disassembled, turrets removed and reused as fixed anti-tank gun positions, hulls buried or abandoned. In effect, a tank ceased to be a mobile beast of war. It became part of the island earth, and steel fused. Waiting? Let me recount a particular mission that stands out almost cinematic in its horror and cunning. On the 28th of February 1945, as the Marines of the 21st Regiment pushed towards one of the northern ridges, the Japanese 2nd Company's tanks, previously hidden in caves and gullies, suddenly emerged. A Chi-Ha turret rose from the ash, its barrel swinging low. Two Marines fell as the first shells ripped through cover. The attack stunned the Americans, but within moments, bazooka teams primed to hunt such hidden armor opened fire. The 47mm barrel recoiled once, then two bazooka rockets struck home. The tenuous advantage of concealment lost. The crew abandoned the turret. The Marines swarmed forward, grenades and flamethrowers to finish the survivors. The Japanese tank that had lurked like a ghost was gone. That surprise, that moment when a benign slope becomes a killing machine, was emblematic of how these tanks fought. Not as a proud armored force, but as underground predators. Quiet, patient, brutal. The human side of this sub-terra warfare is sobering. The Japanese tank crews, once trained for movement, maneuver, combined operations, found themselves confined in cramped turrets, hidden in the volcanic rock and volcanic ash, breathing stale air, living in fear. Their world was no longer speed and mobility, but patience and concealment. They couldn't advance. They couldn't retreat. They could only wait and fire. For the Marines, young men storming across Badlands, they barely understood every rock. Every ridge, every volcanic cliff held the possibility of ambush. It changed the nature of fear. No longer fear of mortar fire from bunkers, but fear of something silent, mechanical, hidden. They became paranoid, scanning every shadow. That unknowing, not knowing whether a shape was rock or turret, gave the Japanese a weapon beyond shells. Terror, and what is war, if not fear, made flesh? When I compare these illusion tanks of Iwo Jima to the armor on the American side, or the great tank battles of Europe, the contrast is stark. On the American side, you had the well-known M4 Sherman, 75mm gun. Thick armor, mobility, proper tanks in the classical sense. On Iwo alone, the Marines landed with over 100 Shermans plus LVTA for amphibious armored transports, dwarfing the 35 Japanese machines, a 4-to-1 advantage in armor. In Europe, tanks fought in massed formations, blitzkrieg, armored thrusts, tank versus stick malaise. On Iwo, there was none of that. The Japanese rejected mobility. Their tanks were not tools of advance, but of defense. They did not field columns of steel across plains. They embedded them in volcanoes. The result? A surreal duel. Not of armor on armor, but of steel on ash, surprise on expectation, terror on certainty. In that sense, these Japanese weird tanks were more terrifying than contemporary armor because they exploited geography, psychology, concealment. They turned the island itself into a battlefield, made the earth into a weapon. When the battles ended, as they did, slowly, bloody, inch by inch, many of these tanks remained buried or destroyed. Some had their turrets knocked off. Others were blasted by bazookas, grenades, or flamethrowers. The 26th Tank Regiment was decimated. What remained of its men soldiered on as infantry. In the trenches, caves, tunnels of Iwo, fighting to the end. But the memory remains. For me, as narrator and as historian. These Japanese tanks represent a brutal lesson. War doesn't always obey the grand rules of tank doctrine. Sometimes, when the terrain denies advance, when resources are limited, when defeat seems inevitable, ingenuity, however grim, takes over. A tank becomes a rock. A gun becomes a ghost. A soldier's fear becomes the weapon in the final calculus of history. These hidden, static Japanese tanks on Iwo Jima might not have turned the tide. They did not win the island, but they turned the invasion into something different. Not just a battle of numbers and firepower, but a struggle of mind against mind, camouflage against sight, subterranean fear against daylight. They remind us that warfare is not always a clash of steel on open fields. Sometimes it is silence. Sometimes it is ash. Sometimes it is a turret rising from the earth when dawn breaks, and all that stands between survival and slaughter is the roll of a shell, the crack of a bazooka, the courage or terror of a man. So when I look back on that November night in 1944, when the 26th Tank Regiment crowded aboard the Nisshu Maru, when the storm-lashed sea threatened to swallow their last hope, I realize what they carried to Iwo was not only metal and guns, but an idea. An idea born of desperation. If we cannot roll across plains, then we will hide. If we cannot fight head-on, we will vanish into rock. If we cannot outgun them, we will outfear them. That is the story of the weird Japanese tank that surprised American forces at Iwo Jima, not because it was magnificent or powerful, but because it was patient, silent, and deadly. Because it turned the earth beneath men's boots into a weapon. And perhaps that, more than any other tank of World War II, is the truest kind of terror.